Imagine waking up one morning and feeling a pressure in your chest that doesn't belong to any calendar event. No looming deadline, no health scare you can name. It is as if the house of your life has shifted on its foundations overnight, and the runes you thought were familiar, your relationships, your work, your convictions, now echo with a vacancy you cannot map. You reach for explanations. Too much coffee, not enough sleep, a season of stress. None of them quite fit. The feeling persists, like a question with teeth. Here is the first paradox. The thing we most want to eliminate, anxiety, might actually be the clearest signpost pointing toward what we most need to know about ourselves. We treat anxiety as an error message from a faulty brain. Jung calls it a symptom with meaning. Which version are you living with right now? The one that insists anxiety is a medical malfunction to be fixed, or the one that insists it's a conscience, a prophet, a shadow bearing news from the parts of you that have been excluded? You feel the tug of that contradiction. On one hand, society teaches you to minimize discomfort, to normalize calm as virtue and productivity as proof of health. On the other, something ancient and stubborn in you refuses to be soothed. That refusal looks like panic in the grocery line, like avoidance of a phone call, like annoying dread on a Sunday afternoon. It feels unfair, irrational, embarrassing. But what if it is neither unfair nor irrational? What if it is a call to think, to act, to change? That is Jung's proposition, and it shifts the problem from the clinic to the cathedral, from neurology to philosophy. You are being asked, silently but insistently, to face questions you have been trained to avoid. Who are you if not the roles you play, the persona you present? What happens to a life built on borrowed values when the shadow, the disowned parts of your personality, rushes in to claim recognition? How do you meet the anima or animus inside you when their appearances look more like anxiety than romance? These are not mere psychological curiosities. They are philosophical urgencies. What is meaning? What is responsibility? What counts as freedom when the unconscious still steers the helm? Think of anxiety as a lamp swung low through a cavern. It reveals shapes you have not learned to name. It is not merely misfiring biology. It is an encounter with depth. Jung wrote of complexes, autonomous constellations of emotion and memory that charge the present. Complexes are not errors. They are living secrets. When they erupt, they operate like philosophers, dragging you back into a discussion you thought you'd settled. You are forced to interrogate why a voice from childhood, a shame, a disavowed desire, now has the power to rearrange your day. What does it demand of you? What would it mean to answer? The existential tension intensifies when you consider purpose. Modern life sells you a tidy narrative. Choose a career, optimize for success, buy comfort, and you will minimize suffering. Yet the more you follow that script, the more likely something in you will rebel. Jung saw individuation, the lifelong journey toward wholeness, as the process that anxiety often announces. The irony is cruel and exquisite. The strategies you employ to be safe and acceptable often provoke the very unrest you wanted to avoid. So is anxiety a failure of adaptation, or a summons to become more thoroughly alive? You can feel the stakes in your body. The shallow breath, the rushed thoughts, the avoidance that looks like sanity but feels like exile. Imagine if, instead of dissolving into distraction, you leaned into the question as if it were philosophical homework assigned by the psyche. What would you ask? Would you ask about truth, about authenticity, about the hidden loyalties that steer your choices? Would you ask, with Jungian bluntness, which part of you has been refused a voice, and why? And then there is the collective depth Jung points to, the collective unconscious. Your anxiety is not only personal, it resonates with patterns older than your family. How many of your fears are inherited as attitudes toward power, sex, death, or meaning? How many of your restlessnesses are echoes of cultural complexes that need naming and confronting. What would it mean to treat your anxiety not as a private failure, but as a symptom of an era? You are left with a question that refuses closure. Is anxiety an enemy to expel or a messenger to be received? The more you try to dismiss it, the louder it becomes. The more you attend to it, the more it demands transformation. This is the philosophical dilemma Jung invites. Do you reduce inner turmoil to pathology, or do you recognize it as a necessary dialectic in the formation of a self? You are not being asked to accept an easy platitude. You are being asked to wrestle. What would it require of you to turn toward that wrestling? And if the wrestling leads somewhere, what kind of person will you become on the other side? The next moment of our exploration will unmask the mechanics of this call, the shadow that speaks through anxiety, the archetypes that shape its language, and the path Jung outlined for answering what your anxiety is actually asking of you. You begin to see the hidden problem not as a fault in wiring, but as a political and metaphysical pressure, an insistence from depths you have been trained to ignore. What if anxiety persists because your culture, its markets and myths, demand a truncated self, efficient, marketable, tidy, hollowed of inconvenient yearnings? What if the truth is that anxiety is the smoke alarm for an identity that has been compromised by compromises? Jung would say the psyche hums with demands that have been repressed into complexes. Nietzsche would add that those demands are often the will to power displaced into safer trophies, status, consumption, performance. The result is a life arranged around appearances, while the interior silently organizes its revolt. Look at the psychological mechanics. A complex forms when a cluster of unmet experiences and emotions coalesce into a semi-autonomous force. It lives in your reaction patterns, seizing attention at moments of vulnerability and directing your behavior like an actor reading from a different script. You think you are being rational. You are being hijacked. The persona, that social mask you polish to navigate the world, becomes a fortress. Inside it, the shadow gathers, aggrieved and patient. Anxiety is often the shadow's courier, an urgent knock with no polite reply. Jung's concept of projection explains how you then see in others what you deny in yourself, and your relationships become mirror mazes where your unlived content is projected, rejected, then feared. How many arguments, silent withdrawings, and sudden dissolutions of intimacy are the fallout of these disowned scripts taking back their voice? Philosophically, the roots run deeper. Schopenhauer taught that suffering is woven into life's fabric, not merely an aberration, but the condition of existence. If you live as though suffering were a medical error, you're bound to be surprised when it insists on appearing. Nietzsche insists you must create values rather than inherit them. He would call your anxious restlessness a prompt toward reevaluation, a dangerous gift that dares you to revalue your values. Sartre's existential diagnosis sharpens this. Anxiety, or anguish, is the experience of radical freedom, the vertigo of being responsible for inventing yourself in a world without preordained meaning. That kind of freedom is terrifying. Most people trade it for the easier terror of conformity. Society compounds the anguish by offering quick pharmacological relief and consumable distractions that function like anesthetics. Aldous Huxley's warnings about opiate pleasures weren't merely about drugs, but about a culture cultivating false serenity, manufactured happiness that dulls the impulse to look inward. Viktor Frankl, in contrast, held up meaning as the antidote, but his meaning is earned through confrontation with suffering, not its avoidance. If your environment prizes comfort above depth, your nervous system learns to mistake sedation for safety. The hidden problem is structural. Institutions, marketplaces, and technologies conspire to make you small in ways you barely recognize, rewarding the suppression of difficult inner voices until those voices thunder. This pressure rewires your behavior. You become skilled at distraction and etiquette, proficient in smiling while your chest caves. You adopt rituals that look like care but are actually concealment. scrolling, overworking, agreeing to what you don't believe in, optimizing rest in order to return more quickly to obligations that erode you. Anxiety then shows up as decrees, sleeplessness, avoidance, fury, numbness. It colors your emotions with a particular texture, shame braided with urgency, guilt silvered by impotence. Identity begins to feel like costume rather than birthright. Who are you under the mask? The question accumulates like debris on a riverbank, eventually damming your flow. The hidden force also shapes narrative identity, the stories you tell about causality, worth, future. If you narrate your life as a series of obligations and dangers, your imagination becomes narrow, anticipating threat where there may be none. If you were taught to value external validation, your inner narrator becomes a bureaucrat of value, auditing every desire as risky. Jung would say that when the ego refuses to include the shadow will stage events to force recognition. Think of sudden career collapses, breakdowns, compulsions, gifts wrapped in crisis. These are not arbitrary punishments, but strategically cruel attempts by the psyche to restore balance. The paradox is that what you most want to avoid, loss, pain, humiliation, is sometimes the theater in which your liberation plays out. There is a social contagion to this hidden problem. Cultural archetypes, the heroic breadwinner, the effortless achiever, the perpetually youthful, circulate like memes in the collective unconscious, shaping what you fear and desire. Anxiety mutates into moral failure when you compare your messy interior life to curated exteriors. It becomes political when groups weaponize fear to consolidate power, promising safety in exchange for surrendering essential freedoms of inquiry and responsibility. When populations are coached to outsource meaning to brands, leaders, or algorithms, the very labor of individuation is outsourced too. The cost is existential, souls left unexamined, a species habituated to smallness. And yet, the pressure also contains a promise. Jung's individuation is not mere self-improvement. It is a reorientation of the soul toward its own depths. Your anxiety, if treated as message rather than malfunction, becomes a map. It converges the psychological and philosophical into practical urgency, to ask which life you were meant to live, to reclaim denied parts, to accept the ethical weight of freedom. But this is dangerous work. It requires you to tolerate destabilization, to risk relationships as they are, to allow the persona to thin and the shadow to come into view. It asks you to meet archetypal forces, not with cleverness, but with courage. So where does this leave you now, with the lamp of anxiety still swinging? You feel both exposed and summoned. The hidden problem will not be solved by mere techniques. Its roots are threaded through metaphysics, culture, and the architecture of your own defenses. The deeper consequence looms. If ignored, the psyche radicalizes. It will seize life through compulsions and projections. If addressed, there is the possibility of a fuller person emerging, one who can carry paradox, responsibility, and meaning. Which risk will you accept? The next section will follow that question into the mechanisms of the shadow's speech and the steps Jung prescribes for answering its summons, not as therapy alone, but as a philosophical reformation of the self. You begin to notice the ways anxiety quietly architects your life, not like a sledgehammer, but like a slow, patient architect who rearranges furniture when you sleep. It moves your social maps, your career choices, the small rituals that stitch each day together. The first unseen consequence is cognitive. Bias scaffolds the narrative anxiety wants you to live by. Confirmation bias sifts your experiences for proof of danger. Negativity bias lets a single threat drown out 1,000 neutral or joyful moments. The availability heuristic makes recent alarms loom larger than distant truths. The result is a brain that feels betrayed by its own stories, convinced of threat because it has been trained by biology and culture to assume it. Look at the nervous system and the pattern sharpens. The amygdala sounds alarms before your prefrontal cortex can interrogate them. The HPA axis floods your bloodstream with cortisol. The sympathetic nervous system primes fight, flight, freeze. Allostatic load accumulates like debt. Poor sleep, tightened muscles, immune changes. Small inflammations that whisper of long-term cost. Neurologically, repeated anxious rehearsal creates neural highways. Neuroplasticity becomes a double-edged sword. The circuits that fire together wire together, and soon your mind favors anticipation of catastrophe as a default setting. What felt like an occasional warning becomes temperament, and temperament becomes fate unless interrupted. Cultural conditioning is the quiet engineer that gives anxiety its materials. From childhood you inherit scripts. Be useful. Don't be too much. Success equals safety. Social media amplifies archetypes of perfection and erases context, training your mirror to a one-dimensional reflection. Market cultures praise efficiency and penalize depth. Algorithms learn your anxieties and sell you solutions. But their solutions are rarely the soulless work. They are quick fixes that increase engagement and keep you productive. So you learn to manage appearances, while the interior is permitted only scheduled maintenance. What looks like calm is often a well-trained suppression. The cost is subtle but cumulative. You can see how this becomes political. When populations are thin in inner life, they are thick in external compliance. Anxiety becomes a lever for control. Promise safety and trade a sliver of freedom in return. Fear makes for malleable citizens who exchange autonomy for structure, who elect leaders promising certainty and consume narratives that shrink moral imagination. Jung's collective unconscious pulses here. Archetypal images of the anxious crowd have always answered to charismatic orders or soothing spectacles. The unseen consequence is that private unease migrates into public forms, shaping policy, rhetoric, and the way institutions define normal. Projection acts as a contagion. You deny parts of yourself and find them in others. They are unstable. They are reckless. They are needy. Relationships become theaters of displaced conflict. What you refuse to integrate becomes the accusation you lob. This creates a loop of misunderstanding where no one hears the real complaint, the psyche's plea for wholeness. Think of every argument where one partner felt inexplicably accused. The scene is often less about the present quarrel and more about the shadow knocking for recognition. The social fallout is intimate yet systemic. Communities fragment into camps of mutual blame while the shadow grows bolder. Narratives harden into identity. You start telling a life story that explains away discomfort with tidy causality. I am anxious because of X, and then you live into that diagnosis as destiny. Jung would object. Reduce the signal to a single cause and you lose the message. Anxiety is multilingual. It speaks in childhood grief, in cultural taboos, in biological predispositions, in unmet creative longings. To flatten it into one explanation is to render most of it invisible. The unseen consequence is a narrowing imagination. Fewer possible selves, fewer tolerations for ambiguity, fewer experiments with being. Your habits become safety rituals that are not safety at all. Scrolling feels like monitoring. Busyness feels like armor. Perfectionism appears as virtue. These adaptations protect a version of you that is small enough to survive the cultural marketplace, but not large enough to be fulfilled. Jung's individuation insists that such protection is costly. The shadow gathers power until it can no longer be contained. The consequence? Compulsions, burnout, sudden crises that look like failures, but function like callbacks from the psyche demanding a different contract. The moral landscape shifts too. When anxiety is viewed solely through a medical or managerial lens, responsibility is frequently outsourced. Take this pill, buy that app, optimize your schedule. These are not always wrong, but they are insufficient. Jung asked for moral engagement. Anxiety, in his view, calls forth a kind of ethical apprenticeship to oneself. If society rewards the opposite, numbing over deepening, then the unseen consequence is moral stagnation. You become proficient at maintaining the shell of a life without practicing the harder virtues: attention, courage, integration. There is urgency here because the cost compounds not only in your biography, but in the health of communities and cultures. The individual who refuses to face their shadow is more likely to project it into politics, more likely to seek scapegoats, more likely to make decisions out of fear rather than considered values. Multiply that pattern, and you have societies that prioritize security theater over soulcraft. Long term, this produces brittle systems that crack under the strain of inevitable change. Still, the pressure holds a strange clarity. Anxiety, when stripped of moral panic, exposes the seams where your life has been stitched too quickly. It highlights what has been omitted: longing, grief, creativity, unresolved loyalty. Jung's concept of complexes explains why certain triggers feel disproportionately catastrophic. They land on old wounds, dressing up as crisis in the present. The unseen consequence is a ledger of debts the psyche demands be paid, relationships that need renegotiation, careers asking for revaluation, beliefs that must be examined. You feel the urgency because ignoring this ledger makes the debt compound. Every avoidance is interest applied. Every distraction is a tiny foreclosure on possibility. The trap is not that anxiety exists, it always will, but that you allow it to become the architect of a life unconsciously designed. The question that grows louder is not how to eliminate the anxiety, but how to stop letting it decide the turns of your existence. Hold that tension a moment. The breakthrough waits, but first you must acknowledge how profoundly implicated your mind, body, and culture already are in constructing the cage you feel. The breakthrough waits, but first you must acknowledge what it asks of you. Not a quick fix, but a radical reorientation. Imagine that acknowledgement like the first match struck in a dark hall. Suddenly the shapes you feared take on edges, and you can see not only the damage, but the secret architecture beneath it. This is rebellion, but not the noisy kind promised by late-night manifestos. It is quieter and more consequential. The rebellion of waking up to your inner economy and refusing to keep paying interest on illusions. What if the first act of liberation is counterintuitive? Not to quiet your anxiety, but to listen to it as if it were a messenger. Jung taught you to treat symptoms as language. So begin by asking the symptom questions. Where does this panic come from? Which voice in you feels unheard? Name the complex that charges your mornings. Speak to it on paper as you would to an urgent, wounded child. This is active imagination made practical. You don't need a couch or a guru, only courage and pen. When you answer the messenger instead of anesthetizing it, you break the tyranny of reflex and begin to redirect energy back toward agency. Freedom asks for experiments, not parlor tricks. Try a small, controlled exposure. Allow yourself to feel the edge of the fear without acting to neutralize it. Sit with a trembling coffee cup. Let the urge to scroll pass. Notice the story your mind invents, and then ask, is that story true? Repeat. Each time you practice toleration, you widen the threshold of tolerance. You are training a nervous system that has been conditioned to expect catastrophe, to notice how often catastrophe does not actually arrive. This is rebellion against the brain's worst forecasts: pragmatic, surgical, stubborn. Another paradox. You will reclaim control by surrender, not to helplessness, but to complexity. Individuation, Jung's word for becoming whole, requires that you stop presenting a single polished persona to the world and start cultivating an inner council. Invite the shadow to sit at the table. Let the anxious part speak, then let your reason and your creativity respond. Make minutes of these inner meetings. What does each part want? What compromises can be negotiated? The aim is not to abolish conflict, but to integrate it so that conflict no longer hijacks your life. Integration is not capitulation. It is appropriation of volatile energy into conscious aims. History offers blueprints if you look beyond triumphalist narratives. Consider Kierkegaard, who named anxiety the dizziness of freedom and chose inward courage over public comfort. Think of Nietzsche, who turned his nervous intensity into a philosophy of self-creation. He refused the values handed to him and revalued them. Viktor Frankl, surviving unspeakable horror, converted suffering into purpose and taught that meaning is the lever that lifts despair. Closer to Jung himself, Jung's own breakdown, his confrontation with the unconscious, became the crucible from which analytical psychology emerged. These figures did not escape anxiety. They excavated meaning from it and thereby altered the world's vocabulary about suffering. You can do the same at your scale. What would your revaluation look like? Practicality insists here. Start with public boundaries. Iterate what you will refuse to do in order to preserve the psychic space to think. Say no, not as performative virtue, but as a structural reform. Unfollow feeds that compress your inner weather into headlines. Reduce the number of forums where your value is measured by metrics. Reclaim time for unstructured attention. Walking, drawing, emptying the sink without scrolling. In these small rebellions, you create a climate for thought to regrow. Language is a lever. Replace pathological vocabulary. I have an anxiety disorder with interrogative vocabulary. Anxiety is telling me X. What does X want? That shift is not denial of suffering. It's a redistribution of agency. Naming your anxiety as a messenger means you are not its victim, but its interlocutor. Projection loses its power when you can say to yourself, "This fury I see in them is a clue about something I own." Suddenly relationships change. You argue less about culprits and more about self-held truths. You stop letting the world write your internal script. Ritual accelerates integration. You do not need liturgy to invent ritual. You need regularity. A 5-minute dawn practice, a journal entry, a question, a concrete tiny risk for the day becomes a habit that undermines panic's monopoly over decisions. A weekly pause to inventory narratives you are living by reveals where market logics replaced moral choices. Rituals anchor you when archetypes rush in. They give the ego a posture of steadiness while the unconscious unspools. There is a collective dimension to this rebellion. Individuation is not isolation. When you refuse to outsource meaning to brands and leaders, you make public the fact that sources of authority can be reclaimed. Communities of reflection, people who take their interior lives seriously, are antidotes to mass sedation. Find or form a group that practices honesty in small, humble ways. Shared readings, conversational nights where you trade projections for reflections. Accountability rooted in curiosity rather than judgment. These microcultures corrode the cultural complexes that profit from your quiet numbing. Radical thought requires radical patience. You will not arrive at wholeness in 6 weeks. Jung's path is lifelong. The rebellion against the automatic life is generational work. Measure progress in tolerances gained, not in comfort restored. Celebrate the mornings you do not flee. Celebrate the conversation where you acknowledge projection. Celebrate the boundary you set that kept you from further depletion. These are insurgent acts, small but cumulative, and they rewire destiny. Finally, accept that power looks different than you thought. True power is less about commanding the external world and more about stewarding your internal counsel. It is the capacity to bear paradox, to hold your terror and your tenderness in one hand. It is the refusal to outsource conscience. The rebellious person you become will be quieter than propaganda promises and fiercer than your polite habits. You will not be immune to anxiety. You will be able to read its grammar and answer with intention. So stand, strike that match. Let the lamp of anxiety illuminate what you have avoided. The rebellion begins not with a manifesto, but with one deliberate, disobedient act toward yourself, a question asked honestly, a truth spoken, a boundary set, a shadow welcomed. This is the work of individuation. Slow, dangerous, liberating. You are not simply surviving your inner storms. You are learning to navigate them, and by doing so, to steer a life that is no longer written by outsourced certainties, but authored by the soul. Strike the match again, and let this be the last illumination that reframes everything you thought you were defending. The ultimate truth Jung forces into view is ruthless and merciful at once. Your anxiety is not a glitch to be excised, but a metaphysical summons pointing to the very possibility of an examined life. It is the psyche's ultimatum. Continue outsourcing authority to markets, metrics, and prepackaged comforts, and you will live small. Accept the summons, and you will be asked to become larger than your fear. What do you fear more, the pain of change or the slow corrosion of living on borrowed values? Which death haunts you? A sudden collapse or the quiet death of never having been yourself? Anxiety, in Jung's vocabulary, is the dizziness of freedom given shape. It means you are no longer authorized to live by default scripts. That is terrifying because it strips safety from its illusions. It is enlivening because without that stripping, you remain a spectator at your own funeral. A paradox follows. The very impulse that makes you flinch, the urgent need to dull, to hustle, to anesthetize, is itself the engine that will, if left unchecked, turn your life inward into a narrow tunnel of safety. The more you attempt to eliminate the tremor, the more you narrow the world to what can be controlled. The more you answer the tremor, the more the world opens, not as a risk-free playground, but as a dense, morally charged terrain where meaning must be created and defended. Which risk do you want to cultivate? The risk of shrinkage or the risk of growth? You are asked now to adopt a different grammar for suffering. Where you once read anxiety as failure, read it as address. Where you once medicated sensations into silence, listen to their syntax. What archetype is stirring? Which complex has been activated? Name it, not as diagnosis alone, but as a character in your inner myth. Give it voice. Ask it why it has taken such measures to be heard. This is not therapeutic flattery. It is philosophical engagement. You are entering a courtroom where your psyche presents its case and you, finally, must appear. There is a metaphysical implication you cannot avoid. If anxiety is a summons, then the universe in which you move is not inert, but participatory. Meaning is not given in the marketplace. It is negotiated in the soul. This collapses the comforting narrative that life is a neutral arena where pain is random and must be buffered. Instead, pain is dialectic, a question posed by existence to which you must reply. Do you answer with avoidance or with authorship? Answering requires an ethics of interiority. Courage here is not heroic spectacle, but the everyday discipline of choosing to see. You apply yourself to the slow work, naming projections, tolerating tremors, keeping the small rituals that signal allegiance to a life worth inhabiting. You structure your calendar to protect unstructured attention. You choose companions who demand honesty more than applause. You practice active imagination, dialoguing with parts of you that are not yet integrated, until the council of inner voices forms a deliberative body rather than a war zone. These acts are small. Their effect is tectonic. But practical reforms alone will not suffice. The deeper shift is ontological. You stop believing that your identity is a commodity and start living as if identity is a task. The persona is no longer the endgame, but a tool to be revised. The shadow is no longer a monstrous afterthought, but a resource to be harvested for vitality. Individuation, Jung's slow work, becomes less a self-help slogan and more a philosophical vocation in which your life is the argument you must make and live by. What does that look like in a moment of panic? Instead of reaching automatically for distraction, you pause and ask the question beneath the fear. What is this fear protecting? What does it prevent me from doing? Which value is endangered? Answer honestly, even if the truth is small. You fear rejection because you have never spoken an unpopular truth. You fear failure because you have never tried an unmarketable ambition. The answer directs action. The anxiety dissolves not entirely, but into a compass. The sharper the fear, the truer the needle. There is another paradox waiting. The loneliest deeds are the most contagious. When you choose to face your internal summons, you do not merely salvage your life, you model a possible world. The people around you feel the permission to breathe, to name, to stop pretending. Jung called this the interplay between the individual and the collective unconscious. One person as individuation nudges a strand in the cultural web. What begins as a solitary rebellion can become a quiet contagion of reflection. Now imagine the cinematic end of this revelation. You stand on a shoreline where old certainties break like waves against rocks. The lamp of anxiety in your hand is no longer a torment, but a lighthouse. Its beam cuts through the fog, not to promise ease, but to reveal safe passages you must navigate. Behind you, the town of comforts glows cozy and small. Ahead, the open sea is dangerous and luminous. You are not asked to leap blindly into heroics. You are invited to pilot, to learn the currents of your own depths, to become cartographer of an interior ocean. This final realization is not kind to comfortable narratives. It demands that you make sacrifices of time, of curated identity, of the illusion that psychological hygiene equals moral maturity. Yet it offers something larger than relief. A life that can hold ambivalence, that can be accountable, that can translate pain into meaning. It promises not a painless existence, but their opposite. A life that, when you answer the summons, feels like a work of art in progress. So act. Ask the question you have been avoiding. Keep the boundary you promised yourself. Call the hidden name of the complex that stirs you. Show up to the small ceremonies that anchor a new grammar of being. Do this, and you will find that anxiety, which once felt like an accusation, has become your most uncompromising teacher. It will not coddle you. It will not flatter you. It will insist you bear the responsibilities of freedom. And when you finally do, when you answer however haltingly, the echo will be strange and vast. The tremor will recede enough to let you hear other things. Grief, as particular melody, desire's stubborn plea, creativity's soft war drum. You will not be free of storms, but you will be able to steer them. In the slow light of that stewardship, your life stops being an imitation and begins to look like testimony. The final image is simple and terrible and kind. You, alone under a vast night sky, learning to read the weather of your soul, and, by that reading, tending a luminous map for others who will follow.